building CRUD-based Spring Boot applications with Hibernate and JPA, exposing those CRUD operations through RESTful APIs, and then testing those RESTful APIs with web-based front ends that might be provided through Swagger or even HTML and JavaScript that you write on your own. Well, that is the heart of cloud-native microservices development with Spring Boot, and that is exactly what this tutorial is all about. Just give me a few minutes of your time, and I'll make you very, very dangerous with these ORM tools like Hibernate and JPA. I'll also make you very dangerous with RESTful APIs as well. Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com. I have to be one of the world's biggest Spring and Spring Boot advocates, and I'm super excited to share this project with you. What we're going to build is a simple bookstore application. We're going to use MySQL as the backend, but we're going to be pretty hands-off when it comes to MySQL. We're going to let Hibernate and JPA do all the heavy lifting when it comes to the database. Instead, we're just going to be Java developers. We're going to create classes. We'll create a book class to model out our book application. We'll decorate it with a few JPA and Hibernate annotations, and then we'll tell Hibernate to go on its merry way, read those annotations, and create the underlying tables for us. And when we update our Java beans in code, have Hibernate persist those changes to the database. That's what ORM tools are all about, right? Taking the data in our objects and mapping that data into a relational database. Object relational mapping. Now, once we've got all the Hibernate and JPA stuff out of the way and our CRUD application is working, we're going to use some Spring Web APIs to expose those CRUD applications through get, put, post, and delete HTTP operations. It's going to be incredibly simple. I think you'll be really surprised by how simple it is. And then once we finish that, what we're going to do is we're going to use Swagger to test our APIs. If you haven't used Swagger before, it is a huge payoff. You're going to be super impressed. And then finally, when we get everything working, we're actually going to ask ChatGPT to create an HTML and JavaScript page to give us an actual web page that will allow us to interact with our application. We're not HTML and JavaScript developers, but still, it's pretty cool to see the fruits of our labor being called upon through a standard web application. It's a super cool project, and I know you're going to learn a lot. So boot up your favorite IDE, be it VS Code, IntelliJ, or Eclipse, and get ready to create a brand new Spring Boot application, because that is exactly what we're going to do next. I've got my glasses on, so you know I mean business, and the business at hand is creating a new Spring Starter project. Now, by the way, as I start this off, I just want to let you know, if you watch my videos at 2x or 1.5 speed, I tend to speak clearly so you can still understand what I'm saying and you can learn at twice the speed. So give it a try, and then you can always rewind if you want to see something again, or pause if you missed something. But for now, I want to create this Spring Boot project, and I'm going to call it CRUD REST JPA demo. It's going to be Maven type, Java version 17, com mcnz.spring as the group name and package. That all looks good to me. What's important is the dependencies, and I want to do JPA with Hibernate and MySQL and do it RESTfully. For REST, I need Spring Web, so I'm going to add in Spring Web. In order to do MySQL, I need the MySQL database driver. In order to do restarts with my web server, I need dev tools to be added. And finally, if we want to do JPA, we need to add Spring Data JPA. Now that looks very, very handsome to me. Just going to look at the selected starters there. Normally, I would have you add the Spring Boot actuator, which gives you all sorts of metrics. It's one that I add to every project. I've got a tutorial up on that if you want to check it out. But I'm going to keep things fairly simple for now. So I'll click Finish, and that project will get started. Now, I will say there's one other dependency I want to add in. I want to add in Swagger, which means adding the Spring Doc Open API Starter Web MVC UI. I know it's a mouthful, but just find it over on Maven repository, or you can find it in the description or the tutorial over on the serverside.com. Copy that. This is going to make testing our applications a lot easier. This is going to give us a web UI inside of our project that will allow us to test all of the different RESTful endpoints. So I'm going to go over to my project. I'm going to double click on that POM file. There's a lot of stuff in this POM file. I'm going to see if I can find that dependencies section so you can see all of those dependencies there, which are all the Spring Boot starters that we've added to our project. And I'm going to add in, may as well make it the first one. The order doesn't matter. I'm going to add in that Spring Doc Open API Swagger dependency. It doesn't say Swagger in there, but that's what we call it. Now I'm going to click Control-Shift-F in order to format that and make it look as handsome as I am, and then Control-S to save that file. And I'm going to close that POM file, and we're not going to have to deal with that POM file anymore. We are building a bookstore type application here, and the title of this video is going to be Spring JPA with Hibernate and MySQL. So we are going to need a MySQL database. I'm going to assume that you've already installed MySQL. I've got a tutorial on how to install MySQL on Windows if you want to check that out. It's not too difficult. When you open up the MySQL Workbench, you'll want to move to that Schemas tab, and you want to create a brand new schema. Not every database needs a schema to be created, but the schema is actually what we reference in the JDBC URL that allows Spring Boot to connect to MySQL. So this is very, very important. So I'm going to choose the option to create a schema. I'm just going to call it Bookstore. It's the Bookstore schema. I'm going to click Apply. I'm going to click Apply again. I'm going to click Apply as many times as I need to. I'm going to click Finish. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to look at that Bookstore schema. Now there's no tables in it. We're going to allow Spring Boot through JPA and Hibernate to actually create the tables for us by adding a little setting into the application properties file that says, hey, anytime something changes in our object model, go and update the database structure so that it maps to it. And in fact, why don't we do that right now? Let's head over into our Spring Boot application, go into that resources folder and find application.properties. And there's a couple of things that we have to add in here if we want our Spring Boot application to be able to connect to MySQL. The first thing that we need to add is a reference to the JDBC URL, and that goes under a setting called spring.datasource.url. Double check my spelling on that. Spring is persnickety about spelling. And the URL is this. It's going to be using the JDBC protocol. Almost always does. I guess you could use ODBC, but that's rare. The database type is MySQL that we're going to be connecting to. The URL to get to it is localhost:3306. Got to get that right. And of course, the schema that we're going to connect to is Bookstore. That's the schema that we just created. That is the JDBC URL. That tells Hibernate how to actually connect to that backend database when JPA calls go into it. That is required. We also need the username and password. So spring.datasource.username equals root, and spring.datasource.password for me equals password, but don't tell anybody about that. And now, I told you there was a magic setting that tells Hibernate to create database tables and add columns and even joins between tables depending on what happens in our object model. It's this. It's spring.jpa.hibernate.ddl-auto equals update. And that tells Hibernate anytime that a change happens in our object classes, any relationship is created, a brand new entity is created, update the underlying database. But don't delete the data. There's something called create that has Spring Boot create the database from scratch, so it drops everything and then creates all the new tables. We want to keep some of the data that we stuff into that table around between reboots of the application. So spring.jpa.hibernate.ddl-auto equals update is the setting that we want to have in that application properties file. And of course, this is supposed to be modeling a bookstore. And we're not animals. We create Java classes to represent the components that we're going to be working with. That's what we do in Java. So I'm going to come over here. If we're going to have a bookstore, I need a class called, you guessed it, book. It's going to be a simple class, not going to be too much to it. I do need to decorate it with an entity annotation. I'm going to click Control-Shift-O, make sure it's the Jakarta persistence entity. Jakarta is the new Java EE. So Jakarta.persistence.entity. This allows me to create a Java bean, but at the same time, that annotation says to JPA, the Jakarta Persistence API, you know what? This needs to be persisted to a database. So when you run, make sure a database called book is created. And if any books are created inside of the application, well, take care of managing the persistence for us. And then we just add properties in here. We do need a property, I'll make it of type int, of ID. This is sort of one place where databases impose on our Java code. I wouldn't normally put a property called ID in a Java bean, but we need that in order to support persistence, right? Because you have to have a primary key for every record that you have in a database table. So quite often we just put a property called ID inside of our Java beans. We put a couple of annotations on here. @ID is one of them. Control-Shift-O to organize those imports. And be careful, it's not the Spring Framework ID in this case, it's the Jakarta ID in this case. If we were just doing Spring Data, well, we might use the Spring one. But here, with Spring Data JPA, it's got to be the one from Jakarta EE. And after that, we've got to add some information in that explains to Hibernate how to actually generate new primary keys if somebody creates a brand new book. And so you'll often see this annotation on a Java bean that you create. It's like @generated_value. And what's the strategy for creating new IDs in the system when a new record is created? We say strategy equals generation type.identity, and you can see that right there. Control-Shift-O once again to organize the imports, and we're now getting closer to where we want to be. I'm going to even add in another field. I'm going to say private string title, right? Every book has a title, and you know what? I'm going to stop right here. I've told you all about how Hibernate can take your Java beans and map them to a database and create database columns and create database tables. Look at MySQL right now. There is nothing there under the list of tables for the bookstore. I do a refresh, nothing appears. Right now I have said, you know what? I want this book class to be persisted to the database. And every instance of a book has its own unique ID, and every book's going to have a title as well. I haven't written any code yet, really, as far as getting this application to run. But I'm going to right-click on this application and say Run as a Spring Boot app. Click OK to make sure that all of my properties are saved. Allow access to allow the REST APIs to run. Watch this. There's a lot of stuff in that console there. But I don't see any errors. I'm going to minimize that, restore the size of that. And then I'm going to come over to MySQL Workbench, right-click on Tables, refresh all, and boom. That was enough to actually get Hibernate to create a brand new table called Book in the database to map to our book Java bean. And are there any columns there? Look at that. ID, and title. That has already been added simply because we have a Java bean where we put into that Java bean the fact that this book is an entity that we want the Jakarta EE persistence API and Hibernate to persist. And we added a couple of fields in here. ID we had to decorate, but we didn't even put any decorations on the title, and it's still new to actually save that to the database. Now, I want to add a couple of others here. I'm going to say private string author, because every book should have an author. Private double price, and that'll keep track of the price with a decimal. And I don't know, one other thing, I think private string, I'm going to say image URL. I'm not going to actually create an image object here. You could do that and maybe have that persist. I've got Spring DevTools on, and now every time I make a change, the console is going to bark at me. So maybe we'll throw that console window down at the bottom there, and we won't get barked at quite so much. In fact, I might even put that over there so it's a little bit more out of the way. A couple of other things that you might want to add in here. I'm going to double click on book, make it go large size, but I want to add in all sorts of getters and setters. If you're using Lombok, you can just use the Lombok annotation. I'm going to just right click, say generate setters and getters, and select all. So the setters and getters for every field there. And did me dirty there. Look at that. Eclipse. It threw all the properties at the bottom. Obviously, I want them at the top. I think it just goes where you right click and say generate. And the other thing that I want is I'm going to say I want to generate a toString method. So that's going to make it easy for us to figure out what's being updated and what's being printed. So that'll be helpful. And the other thing I'm going to add in is, I don't know, I'm going to add a couple of constructors. And so right over here, constructors using fields. I'm going to add a constructor that just takes the ID. Why not? And I think I'll create another constructor. You should always have a default constructor in there as well. That just is part of the Java Bean specification. So I'll select generate constructor, deselect all, and then we get a constructor in there. Click Control S. Look at that outline for the class there. If the console will settle down for just a minute, and you can see all those properties there and all of those methods. Now, what do you think is going to happen if I right click and say run as a Spring Boot app? It's going to think about it. You're going to see that console come up. It's going to run. And we do have that property that says, hey, Spring, update that database anytime some of the properties change. I'm going to mosey on over to the workbench here. There's only ID and title. How come nothing? I'm just joking. I got to refresh. And boom, all of those properties have been added in. Also notice image URL. They put an underscore there. It's now snake case. That's what that's referred to as, even though we're using camel case inside of our code. So you can see that the tool is doing some mapping from the Java code into that database level. So that's how we connect our Spring Boot JPA applications using some of the configuration here in the application properties, a few JPA, Jakarta Persistence API annotations, a little bit of Java code, and a schema that exists to support our JDBC URL in the MySQL database. Now, that's the start. To actually get some JDBC, JPA, Spring Boot repository objects that allow us to do CRUD operations, that is what we're going to do next. No, I hate to disappoint you, but all the hard work has been done. I'm serious. If you want to do a CRUD application and you've decorated your Java Bean, all you have to do is go into your project and create a brand new interface. The interface I'm going to create is going to be called Book Repository. And this is going to extend another interface called the JPA repository, JPA repository. So I'm going to highlight JPA repository, click OK there. After I am done, I'm going to click Finish. and that interface gets created, it does have to be genericized. And we're going to genericize this by saying that the book repository is going to manage books, and the primary key, the ID of each book, is going to be of type integer, right? And our book class had a field of type int that was the primary key. We have to specify an object here, so the primitive type int can't be specified. So integer is good enough. This is actually going to give us all of the methods that we need to do: create, update, read, and delete. Create, read, update, and delete. And in fact, if you want to add like some functionality, like maybe you want to add find by author method to your code, all you have to do is just add a single line into this interface. Find by author. The parameter that gets passed in is the author. It's going to return a list of books by that author. Control-Shift-O. Make sure that java.util list is imported. And Spring Boot is going to know that, well, author is one of the fields. It's something that can be searched on. Books is the data type that should be returned. And this will actually implement a method that finds all the authors by a given name. If you want to have a find by book containing, Spring Boot just allows you to use that containing word in the title. This is now find by title containing a particular spring. So if we look for the Scrum Master Certification Guide, but just say the word Scrum, that gets returned. Spring Boot even allows you to do things like this. Just say find by price between and provide two doubles in this case, and it'll actually find all the books. It'll create the query for you to find all the books that exist between that minimum and that maximum price. That's it. We don't have to write SQL. We don't have to deal with result sets. That's all we have to do in order to get support for create, read, update, and delete operations in Spring Boot, and even custom finders. It is so incredibly easy. Now, how can we expose this through a REST API? That is what I'm going to show you next. Again, the name of this video is going to be something like CRUD-based REST API. So this is the CRUD part. How do we access this CRUD component in the RESTful APIs? Well, you can see that the name of this component is book repository. We're going to create a REST controller, and we're going to inject that book repository into the controller so that we can gain access to all of these methods. I'm going to Control S to save that book repository file. I'm going to come over to that Spring package. I'm going to create a brand new class. I'm going to call it the book controller. I'm going to click finish here. Nothing, no interfaces to implement, no classes to extend, but I do need to put this annotation, REST controller, on the top there. I'll do Control S to save. There's still an error. Do you see that red X there? I'm just trolling you. Control-Shift-O, that imports the REST controller. And as I mentioned, this REST controller is going to expose our application through some REST APIs. And as it exposes itself through some REST APIs that people can call across the internet, we want to connect to that book repository and call some of its methods. In order to do that, what we do is we auto-wire this in. So I use this auto-wired annotation here. And what am I auto-wiring in? I'm auto-wiring in an instance of that book repository. And I'll just call it book repository because I'm not very creative with names. Book repository. There we go. Do you see that red X there? Control-Shift-O. Now my book controller, my REST controller, is going to expose the RESTful APIs to the world, has access to this book repository that can persist things to the database, create, read, update, and delete. And what I want to do right now is actually implement a method that will expose the create operation, right? C is the first letter in CRUD. Why not do the create operation first? Let's just talk about how this create method is going to work in the API. Somebody's going to be sending us data about a book, a JSON string that's got information, but it doesn't have a primary key. What we're going to do is we're going to use the book repository object to save that information about that book to the database. When the database has saved that, it's going to return to Hibernate a book object that's actually got the new primary key in it. And that whole book object with the new primary key is what we're going to send back to the client. We're going to do all of this with a post invocation. There's about 8 different HTTP methods, about 4 that we commonly use. Get just gets stuff from a server. Post is supposed to be used to create objects and perform operations that are not idempotent. Okay, this is what the method is going to look like here. I said that we're going to use a post mapping. We're going to use a post method. So I just say @post mapping, and somebody is going to post to books, localhost 8080/books, and they're going to provide information about a book that they want to save to the database. As I said, we want to get that information that's sent as part of this request and save that to a database. And when we're done, we want to return to the client information about the book that was saved, including the primary keys. So to do that in a Java way, what we do is we create a public method that returns a book, and specifically a book that's going to have the primary key in it. I'll call the method create book. I think that's a good method name. And the data that's coming in as a JSON string from the client is going to be passed as part of the HTTP request body. And to represent that in code, we just use this request body annotation. We say that we're going to be getting data that maps to all the fields in a book, well, all the fields except the ID, and all of that should come in from the request body. So by putting that annotation in there, we're telling Spring Boot, take that data in the request body and map it into a new instance of a book object. Now this may sound like a lot to handle, but all of this really just gets handled by the book repository, right? It's all going to be done by that Java class, so that Spring Boot JPA component. So in order to get the saved book with all of the information in it, including the new primary key, I just create a variable book, save book equals book repository. That's the resource that's wired in right there. And we say to it, hey, save the book. Save is one of those methods that we get as part of that JPA repository. You can see a bunch of others, right? Find all, find by, save all, delete all of those come automatically for us. You notice there's no update. You can use save for update as well. If you try and save a book that has an ID, it doesn't update. If it doesn't have an ID, it does a brand new save. Now, once we've done that, what comes next? Well, I guess we just got to return that book, right? So return saved book. And there you go. Now, do you see that red X there? Just trolling you. I do have to do a little organization of my imports. Make sure we're using request body there. I think those imports all look handsome to me. There you go. That's how we implement this RESTful API that exposes our Spring Boot JPA CRUD operation for creating, saving a book. Now, how do we test it? That is what we're going to do next. So how do we test this friendly little application? Well, I'm going to make sure that the application's stopped, and then I'm just going to right click and say run as a Spring Boot application. That just makes me feel better about the fact that everything is starting up from scratch. Once this console stops bugging me, by the way, I've got a tutorial on how to minimize the amount of stuff that goes into that console window. We even changed the Spring Boot banner, so feel free to check that out if you like. It looks like everything started up well and everything is going swimmingly. So I'm going to double click console to minimize it or restore it at least. And then I'm going to open up a browser and I'm going to go to localhost 8080. /swagger UI /index.html. And remember, we have just created a RESTful endpoint at /books that takes a book object as its parameter and creates a brand new book in the database when this is called by using that book controller. I'm going to go to Swagger UI /index.html. Swagger opens up and it says to me, hey, there is a RESTful endpoint here for /books that can be invoked through a post operation. Do you actually want to try this out? And I'm like, of course I want to try it out. So I click this beautiful try it out button, and it says, okay, well, we need to send JSON to the server that maps to a book. Give us some data. So I'll say the title will be Scrum Master Certification Guide. The author will be Darcy DeClute. You can actually see that book in the background. And the image is going to be, give me 1 second. Okay, I'm going to right click on the image, copy image address from Amazon, come back to Swagger here, paste that in. Hopefully Amazon doesn't mind me hijacking their image for this tutorial. And I'm going to click execute, which sounds kind of French Middle Ages, but we want to execute the method. We don't want to execute anybody in particular. When that runs, we get a response back that says, well, 200 response code, which says everything looks good. It even sends us the book data back. So it's all the information that we had in the JSON plus the new ID. It says there's a new primary key there, number 1, that was created in the database. But you know where I'm from. I'm from Missouri. I need to be shown this stuff. So I'm going to open up MySQL Workbench. I'm going to right click on that book table. I'm going to say select the first 1,000 rows. And boom, there we go. A new record has been added to that database. Darcy DeClute, Scrum Master Certification Guide, available on Amazon. It looks like we forgot to put the price in there, so apparently it is free right now. So grab all the copies you can before we get that update method implemented and change that to the standard $54.99, which is what we're going to do next after we get that get invocation working. So post mappings are hard. We're playing this game on expert level, but let's lower the difficulty level right now. Let's do a retrieve operation, and we'll use the get mapping for a retrieve. So if you just want data, you're not changing anything on the server, just use a get operation. And I'm going to use this to get all of the books. So I'm going to say, hey, I want a get mapping for that /books URL. And what's going to happen inside of this method, I'm going to move things around a little bit so it's right in the center of the screen. Well, I'm going to have a method here that's going to be public. It's going to return a list of books. So I'll just say that. That's a list of books, genericize that. And the method will be retrieve all books. You know, some people always do a finder, but I mean, it's CRUD, right? So why not just be CRUD-like? It's not square brackets there. It is those chicken lips that we need. And there's a method in the book repository that just returns all the books. So all I have to do here is say return book repository dot find all. That's it. That's going to return all the books. Now, do you see that red X there? Control-Shift-O. Import java.util.list, Control-S. That should work. And with a get invocation, you don't even need Swagger. So I should be able to just open up a browser and say localhost :8080 / what is it, books. And there we go, a nice little JSON string that shows me all the books in the database. Now there's only one right now, so there's not a lot in there, but you know, we could always go to Swagger and say, hey, I want to add another book here. In fact, if I do a refresh on Swagger, it also has the get invocation. So I'm going to add a new book. So I'm going to say, try it out to the post here. I'm going to say Hibernate made easy. That's my book. New versions coming out. You can win a free copy potentially if you join my newsletter. Maybe the price is $44.99 or something like that. And the image URL, there we go. Copy that image address, head back to Swagger, paste that in, click execute. As I said, very Middle Ages as it sounds. execute is done. Did I click it hard enough? It says that it got an ID of 3. I think it skipped number 2 because I think I clicked that button twice. And let's see if that is indeed what happened. I'll go over here to that get invocation on book, say try it out, click execute, and boom, it does look like I hit that button 3 times or 2 times, and there's 2 Hibernate made easies in there. Now, in fact, there is the latest one that's about to come out is an update, so maybe I can update that 3rd one to indicate that it's for version 7 of Hibernate. Updating is exactly what we're going to do next. So let's tackle those update and delete operations. Now, when you update a record, you should know the primary key or the unique identifier of the record that you're operating on. If that's the case, and it's an idempotent operation, then you're supposed to use this put mapping annotation. It's supposed to be an HTTP put. Now, if we know the ID of the record that we want to update, we include that in the path. So the URL ends up becoming books/ID, and I put 2 curly braces in there because I've been doing some React lately. And so this says when somebody wants to update a book, they'll provide us the ID of the book they want to update along with all of the details about what they're going to be updating. And so if they want to update book number 3, it's a put operation to books/3, and in the request body, they're going to give us all the information about the book. Then after we get all that information, we do the update. We'll return a book to the client. So the method will look like this. It'll be public. Let's return a book when we're done. We'll call it update book because I am not very creative. We're going to get passed in the ID of the book that's being updated, and that comes in as a path variable, right? Because it's part of the URL's path, and it's of type ID. And that request body is going to include information about the book. Now that request body probably is going to include the ID as well. There might be situations where it doesn't. So just to be safe, we can say book.set ID to the ID that's passed in. And then again, we can just do the return book repository dot, in this case, it's just that save method again, right? It's the same thing that we did up on line 21, except it's different, right? One of my favorite sayings, it's exactly the same. It's just different. But there we go. We've now updated the book. All the data has come into us as part of the request body, a JSON string sent by the client. That's part of the RESTful contract. And then we just do the update. And you know what? The delete operation isn't that much different. We do a delete mapping. And with a delete mapping, it'll go to /books/ID, right? Because they'll give us the ID of the record that they want to delete. In this case, we will, well, we're actually going to return something a little different here. Let me move this up on the screen. We're actually going to return something called a response entity. And you've got the opportunity to return a response entity from any method. The response entity can return an object, right? Like the book object to the client, but it can also return a status code as well, which makes it very, very convenient here. With a delete, we deleted the record. So we don't really send anything back, like it's deleted, right? So, and we certainly don't want to send null back. So what we do is just send them a status code that says everything worked, it's A-OK. And so here I'm going to say, you know, we got a delete book method. There's going to be a path variable. And, you know, in this case, the only thing I really need is the path variable. I'm taking the book as an argument too, but really the only thing that I need is that ID of the record that I'm going to delete. I do need a book object because the book repository is object based and takes a book as an argument. But I mean, if I didn't have a book, I could just create one and say book.set ID to the ID that's passed in, and then finally call that book repository and delete the record. And it's book repository.delete. And delete the book, right? And that's about it. And I do got a little error there, Control-Shift-O to organize the imports, but I haven't returned a response entity. And so returning a response entity is just a matter of saying, hey, call the response entity's static OK method and then build that response entity. It looks like this, response entity.ok.build, Control-Shift-O to organize your imports. Let's make sure that I spelled response entity correctly. Okay, that, as I said, that's one thing I hate about Java and Spring. They make you spell things correctly. It just isn't right. Let me just scroll up a little bit so that all of these methods are on the same page. In fact, I think I can almost fit it. I always try and change my font at the beginning of these tutorials and predict how much I can fit on the page at one time. And I want the font to be as big as possible, but also fit the most on the page. So I think I won on this one here, right? The whole class is here minus the imports at the top. That's your basic CRUD operations right here. Now, I'm going to do Control S to save all of this, but I'm going to head back to Swagger UI, and I'm going to come over to Swagger UI. I'll do a control refresh here to make sure all of the data is refreshed. And of course, I did stop my server, so I'll right click and say run as a Spring Boot application. I was getting tired of the console window constantly coming up, so I stopped the app. And if you stop the application, it won't work. That's one of the first troubleshooting steps that I teach people. If it's not working, make sure it's started. So it's started up over there. It's thinking about it anyways. I'm not seeing any red ink like I used to see on my grade 12 English papers. Localhost 8080/Swagger UI, and look at that. Put, delete, get, post. And notice the URLs are like /books and then an ID. Let's just see what's in there by doing a get invocation. Let's try out that get invocation. Let's do that medieval execution. And what comes back? Well, we've got 3 records in there. Now, record number 3 should be for version 7 of the Hibernate book. So let's do that put operation. Let's see what we're going to do. So I'm going to click try it out here. And I think I might need some data down below. I need that JPEG. So I'm going to copy that JPEG just so it's there for me. Copied. And bring it up here. And then just fill this all out. It's record number 3 that I'm going to update. It is Hibernate made easy, version 7. The author is yours truly, Cameron McKenzie. And the price, let's make that $54.99. And I think I'm good. I think I can click execute right here. Oh, and it says the ID is a required field, but it is not provided. Oh, and I only filled out the JSON, right? That parameter, right? That ID right there has to be entered in as well. So a little slap on the wrist there, but let's see if I can execute that now. Let's get it all on the screen because I like doing that. Click execute. And it says, you know what, that worked a lot better. I get the response back, which looks handsome. 200 response code, which is one of my favorites. But you know where I'm from? I'm from Missouri. I got to come in here and take a look at what's going on in that database. So select 100 rows. And there we go. Boom. Hibernate made easy version 7. And you know what? I didn't even have to go in there because Swagger's got my back. I could have just done this get invocation and execute on /books, and I would have seen the same thing. Now, let's say I wanted to delete book number 2. Let's come over here and see this delete operation. I can try this out and say, what do I want to delete? I'm actually just going to type the number 2 in there. Remember, I promised that we probably didn't even have to fill in the rest of the class so long as we set the book's ID to the resource that we want to have deleted. So let's see if I'm being honest there. Click execute. Come down here and boom, a response header of 200. But you know where I'm from. I'm going to do a quick refresh on the page and just make sure I've got all of the latest implementations. Then I'm going to do a get invocation and I'm going to say try it out. Click execute and let's look at this. And boom, ID 1, ID 3, no ID 2. All of my CRUD operations are working. Now, what's the last thing we're going to do? We're going to get a little help from ChatGPT, and we are going to wrap these APIs with a JavaScript and HTML page so you can actually see what this looks like being invoked from an HTML JavaScript application of your own. And that's what we're going to do next. Now, I think we all agree that Swagger Open API is pretty awesome, but wouldn't it be cool if we actually connected our RESTful Spring Boot JPA API to a real HTML and JavaScript page of our own? Now, this is not a tutorial on HTML and JavaScript, but we could always call on our friend ChatGPT to do a little work for us. So I've said, hey, given the following REST API, give me a single HTML page that lists books in a row with delete button and an update button will allow the book to be updated or deleted. I'm going to add some extra details here, like for the image property, actually use image tags, make the delete button red and the update button blue, use modern fonts an online store might use, make it tasteful. But most importantly, here is the API, and I'm going to head over to my workspace here and just copy all of this. A quick copy indeed, paste it into ChatGPT, and let's see what comes out of this. It looks like it's done. I'm going to click this copy code button, and then I'm going to head over to my workspace. I'm going to go into that static folder. That's the folder that sticks to your clothes when you bring it out of the dryer. I'm going to create a new file called index.html, and I'm just going to paste all of that code in there. That looks pretty handsome. Then I'll come over to this HTML page here, and I'll go localhost 8080/index.html, click enter, and all of a sudden we've got a beautiful page from ChatGPT. Let's see if we want to update the price of that Scrum Master certification guide. I click update, and the opportunity comes over here. And why don't we give everybody a discount today? $34.99, worth every single penny. And who knows, maybe you won a copy of my Hibernate Made Easy book because you subscribed to my newsletter and you won the raffle. So maybe we'll take that one off by clicking delete, and boom, it is gone. But again, you know where I'm from. I'm from Missouri. And is that actually what it says in the database? And yes, indeed it does. And there you go. That is how incredibly easy it is to create a JPA Hibernate CRUD application that exposes itself through REST APIs and even has a nice little HTML and JavaScript page connected to it, all in Spring Boot. I think we can all agree Spring Boot's pretty amazing.